Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into a stack of source material that tells the story of a courtroom battle that, on the surface, looked almost impossible to win.
Yeah, and according to these documents, it ended up challenging the very system it took place in.
We're focused specifically on excerpts from a book called Pam Bondi, A Courtroom Reckoning. These documents detail a really high-profile defamation lawsuit that's brought by Whoopi Goldberg against Pam Bondi.
That's right.
And our mission in this deep dive is to really understand how this fight, which seems so unequal, unfolded. We want to look at the key legal principles that, the source says, became critical weapons in that courtroom.
And also the surprising ways this case resonated, far beyond those walls. We're here to help you, our listener, pull out the most important nuggets and those real aha moments from this pretty fascinating story.
According to our source, Pam Bondi, who was a former attorney general, right?
Right.
She found herself in this really unexpected position, a defendant facing a lawsuit from a major Hollywood star.
And the book hints at how she was initially perceived, maybe dismissed as a relic, a figure kind of faded from the spotlight.
But it quickly reveals, through her actions in this case, what the source calls a legal mind sharp as a blade.
Yeah, it paints quite a picture.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The source starts by taking us to the quiet just before the storm hits. What's the scene it paints?
Well, the scene is set in Pam Bondi's apartment in Washington, D.C. It's the morning of the trial.
Okay.
And the book describes it as, eerily calm, almost like the city itself was holding its breath, kind of unaware of the legal drama about to unfold.
And the description really emphasizes her isolation that morning, doesn't it? Like, no team, no assistant.
No, just her, preparing alone, relying only on her own mind and her will. The source details how the stack of documents on her table was arranged with this almost obsessive precision.
And the book dives into her motivation for choosing to defend herself alone. It wasn't, the source says, out of a sense of, overwhelming strength.
No, not at all. It was more a deep distrust that anyone else could truly handle a trial she believed was, and this is a quote, riddled with the hidden hands of political bias slipping through the cracks of the law.
Wow, that's a strong claim the source makes about the environment she felt she was stepping into.
It really is.
The book even includes a specific warning she received from a former advisor, right?
Yeah, it does. The advisor told her, pretty bluntly, Pam, don't do this. That judge will crush you. This isn't justice, it's politics.
But according to the source, Pam's response was immediate and firm.
She said, that's exactly why I can't back down.
That response really highlights the core of her resolve, the way the source describes it. And even her focus on her appearance that morning, it wasn't about looking good, but about looking precise. Why was that important?
Well, the source suggests she knew any small lapse, any sign of being flustered or emotional could be twisted into a narrative against her, especially by a judge she already suspected of having a preformed bias.
So it was about control.
Yeah, control. Not getting them anything to use against her.
Which again points to that deeper internal strength the book highlights. The source says she understood that the law didn't always automatically side with what was right.
Right, but that it could be forced to if you understood it well enough and were stubborn enough to follow it to the end.
The book even mentions her recalling her Yale teaching mantra in that moment.
That's right. She recalled, emotion makes people react, but only intellect keeps them alive. It sort of set the stage for how she intended to approach this whole thing.
So what did she actually take with her into that courtroom? What was in the briefcase?
The source listed out not just her file documents, proving her statements didn't target anyone, transcripts of the press conference,
Okay.
but also a printed copy of the New York Times v. Sullivan case that's a key legal precedent, and, the book adds, above all, an unshaken resolve.
Her conviction, as the source frames it, was pretty clear then. Staying silent would make her complicit in a lie.
Exactly, and giving up would just make her another example of how the system could allegedly crush dissent. She wasn't there to bow, she was there to stand.
And this entire battle, as the source describes, it all began with a single, seemingly kind of innocuous statement.
Yeah, just one line, really. The book traces it back to Pam Bondi acting as a special advisor during an official White House press briefing.
And the statement was?
It was. Not a single federal dollar should be spent on television programs that deliberately divide the public and incite hatred under the guise of discussion.
Okay. Pre-general policy statement.
Seems like it. But the source details how the media reacted to this. It describes the media clipping and editing the, quote, zeroing in on the phrase extremist television programs. And the book says, immediately linking it to Whoopi Goldberg and her show, The View.
And that reaction, according to the source, it just snowballed.
Totally. It led to a flood of op-eds, headlines asking, did Pam Bondi just label The View an extremist show? And then that hashtag defend the view, started trending overnight.
And the book says this public reaction, the silent media campaign with Pam at its center, it all culminated in a defamation lawsuit from Whoopi Goldberg's attorney demanding, how much was it?
$10 million.
$10 million. Wow.
Yeah. The source describes Pam's reaction to getting that complaint. It wasn't surprised at the attack itself. She saw that as, standard political stuff.
Right.
But what made her pause was the stated reason. Severe harm to reputation and earnings due to direct personal targeting.
Okay.
And this, the book says, prompted an internal question for her. When did voicing a policy opinion not directed at anyone become a personal attack, and if feeling offended alone is now enough to drag someone into court, just how fragile has the foundation of free speech become?
That question gets right to the heart of the principle the source argues she was fighting for.
Absolutely. The book says she reviewed the press briefing video and confirmed it, no names mentioned, only policy budget recommendation.
And her decision, according to the source, was unwavering. She would not apologize.
Why not? As she put it in the book, if I apologize for saying something right, who will have the courage to say what needs to be said next time?
That's a powerful stance. The source mentions a media lawyer friend warned her, right? Told her they were building a narrative, urged her to apologize because they don't play by the rules.
Yeah, but the book says Pam found clarity in that moment. Without institutional power, it was just her and, as she saw it, the truth. And that sharpened her mind.
So she started preparing as her own defense attorney.
Right, revisiting crucial legal precedents, especially New York Times v. Sullivan.
That's the big one for defamation involving public figures.
Exactly. The source highlights this landmark 1964 Supreme Court case because it established that public officials must prove actual malice, meaning the speaker knew the statement was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth.
Okay.
And the book says on every page of her notes for this case, she handwrote, truth needs no permission.
Meanwhile, the media pressure, as the source describes, kept escalating, labeling her a symbol of conservative suppression, even comparing her to a sewer of division.
Pretty harsh stuff, but instead of giving interviews or, tweeting back, the book says Pam chose to answer with the law.
So her final decision on counsel was to represent herself, not out of arrogance,
Yeah.
but because, according to the source, no one understood the case or what was truly at stake better than she did.
Yeah, what the book describes as the fragile line between free speech and the right not to be offended. She framed it as a quiet battle with implications for the very foundations of legal principle.
Her conviction, the book says, was to make the courtroom a forum for reason again.
And that quiet resolve led her directly to the courtroom itself.
Right. The source places us on the 8th floor of the District Federal Courthouse in Washington, D.C., a space the book describes as where the law is interpreted and sometimes, allegedly, reshaped.
And we're introduced to a key figure here, Judge Jerome Masters.
Tell us about him, based on the source.
Well, he's described as a veteran figure, not often on TV, but highly influential in progressive circles. His appearance is noted. Carefully slicked back silver hair, sharp-rimmed glasses.
Okay. And his reputation.
The source presents his reputation as that of a quiet architect of rulings that lean towards social liberty. But, the book adds, this was seen by conservatives, from the source's perspective, as blatant judicial bias. It mentions these hushed conversations, alleging that conservative cases often face setbacks not through overt rulings, but via twisted legal technicalities, strategically worded questions, and what the source calls a chilling form of denial.
And his style, according to the book.
He doesn't argue. He lets them choke on their own argument.
So according to the source, his core belief was that law should be a tool to rebalance history, leaning toward those he sees as historically disadvantaged.
Right. So given that background, when the Goldberg versus Bondi case landed in his courtroom, the source says many in the legal community understood it wouldn't be straightforward.
Makes sense.
While left-leaning scholars, according to the book, praised him, there were whispers, based on internal notes mentioned in the source, about his tendency to cut off opposing arguments. A former clerk is quoted privately saying, "He doesn't break the law, he bends it to its very limit."
So the feeling in the courtroom, as the source describes it, the plaintiff had the advantage.
That was the feeling, yeah. Not just in media presence, but in what the book calls the prevailing ideological current. The source notes that while no one said the verdict was preordained, the glances and handshakes spoke volumes.
Wow. A former colleague even texted Pam, "If this is a chessboard, the black pieces were flipped from the start."
Yeah, pretty stark warning. The source details Pam's entrance through the heavy wooden doors. It describes a half-second silence, slight head tilts, quick assessments. The feeling that you're not welcome here was, according to the book, unmistakable.
A big contrast to her past as a prosecutor, I imagine.
Huge contrast. The presence of familiar faces in the gallery is noted too. Political reporters, pundits, and according to the book on the third row, the view crew. The source says some smirked. Others stared into a recording camera. Pam's strategy, as described in the book, was just ignore them. She knew they were looking to twist anything she did or said.
The source also describes a reporter with a surgical stare aimed right at her, the kind used to strip opponents bare.
And outside the courtroom, a group of women wearing Justice for Whoopi t-shirts. One tried to sneak a photo and smiled what the source calls a thin, Blake-like smile.
But Pam's composure held.
Yeah, the book says she didn't flinch, knowing any reaction would just be fuel for the narrative against her.
Taking her seat at the defendant's table in a worn chair, Pam placed her briefcase with purpose. The source describes this motion as a quiet declaration. "I didn't come here to beg. I came to be heard."
Even a court officer, according to the book, gave her a fleeting frown.
And the source notes the symbolism in the room. The bas-relief of Lady Justice above the bench, her scales tilted.
Which the book describes as feeling like visual irony in that moment.
And then Judge Masters enters.
Right. The source says it created this sudden stillness in the room that spoke louder than any gavel. Pam, gripping her documents, is described in the book as her tether to reality.
And then, the judge's gaze. How does the source describe that?
It says it passed over her quickly but not casually, and according to the book, carried a message. I already know what you're going to say, and I'm not impressed.
Oof.
The source frames this look as a pre-trial verdict, a silent condemnation, asking, in effect, what makes you think you'll be allowed to prove it?
That's a powerful description of the atmosphere. And that's when the realization, according to the source, fully hit her.
Yeah, that the scales had indeed tilted. The person on trial wasn't just Pam Bondi, but the right of any voice that dared to speak against what the book calls the dominant current.
So her goal became crystal clear, to see if intellect alone could push back against a space thick with perceived contempt.
Exactly. And from that stillness, the courtroom silence shifted, becoming anticipation. The show, as the source describes it, was beginning.
Charles Whitman, the plaintiff's attorney, is introduced. Clad in a charcoal gray suit, tailored from the folds of confidence itself. The source says he called Whoopi Goldberg to the stand.
And Whoopi Goldberg's entrance and testimony are described by the source as a carefully crafted performance. She emerged as what the book calls the personification of wounded dignity, draped in black silk.
Okay.
Her steps were measured, her emotion calculated. Her voice, the source notes, was not loud, but layered with emotion so rich it could crack open the most guarded listener.
What were her key points, according to the book?
She emphasized not just a single insult, but the idea that Pam's one sentence had shattered something she had built over 40 years. She described the View as a place where women say what others are afraid to, representing a part of America that's often forgotten.
And she focused on Pam's words, labeling the show extremist and declaring they didn't deserve federal funding.
Right. The source highlights her hand on her chest and describes a single tear sliding down her cheek, noting it was light, but anything but accidental, and measured to the exact beat of a quiver. The source really emphasizes the apparent precision of the emotional display.
And how does the source describe Pam's reaction to this testimony? She wasn't buying it.
The book says Peck watched like a strategist, not a defendant.
Yeah.
She recognized what the source calls the remarkable precision, describing it internally as a performance, crafted to strike at the hearts in the room.
She saw the gap between emotional hurt and actual legal harm.
Exactly. The source says she understood that significant chasm. Her silence was notable. The source says she was the only one in the room unmoved by the emotional display. She was scanning for the seam in the fabric of sentiment where logic could slip in.
A reporter is overheard whispering, "Goldberg's performance is masterful." Eyes, according to the source, were locked on Pam, the only one not visibly reacting.
Her posture is described as spine straight, eyes sharp, lips gently pressed together.
Whitman then presented financial records, described as a thick stack of documents, which the source calls an implied ledger of immeasurable loss.
And Pam, according to the book, remained silent. She knew it wasn't her time, wanting to avoid being cast as the woman interrupting pain. She understood that dismantling such an emotional monologue required, as the source puts it, a strike of precision, not just a louder voice.
Whitman's formal accusation, as described by the source, wasn't simply presenting a touching story, but presenting a reality, supposedly backed by data.
He presented the $10 million figure as direct financial damage, staged, according to the book, as irrefutable truth.
And Pam's internal reaction.
A surge, the source says, not at the number itself, but at how neatly it was staged. She knew, as the source says, numbers could be manipulated.
Whitman's evidence, according to the source, included things like canceled ad contracts, emails, viewership stats, social media drops, boycotts.
Yeah, all traced back, he claimed, to Pam's statement. He submitted documents labeled economic damage and media fallout following public statement, which the source notes read like a pre-printed verdict.
And Judge Masters' reaction.
Nodding, jotting notes, his eyes flickering toward Pam with what the source calls cool confidence, believing the room was shifting in his favor. A reporter's whisper, according to the book, reinforced this. So the 10 million is real.
Whitman's argument about authority was crucial too, wasn't it? According to the source.
Yeah, he wasn't claiming Pam intended harm, but that her words as a government representative carried institutional authority and their impact cannot be excused.
The source says he spoke to the gallery with a manufactured air of empathy.
Right. And Pam, inside, felt her prosecutor reflexes trigger, but kept her face composed, knowing her reaction, the source says, would label her uncontrolled.
Whitman's closing statement, as recounted in the book, asked for fairness, not punishment, arguing that when a statement results in real harm, the law cannot look away.
He closed his folder with a soft, deliberate motion. The room held its breath, waiting for Pam.
And Pam's internal state.
The source describes it as caging a slow, burning fury. Not at the attack itself, but at being distorted, at numbers stripped of context, at emotions standing in for evidence. The source emphasizes she knew she wasn't speaking yet.
And that brings us to Pam's turn. The source says her breathing slowed, containing emotion like a fencer before the draw. She deliberately let seconds pass after Whitman finished.
An assertion of control, the book describes. I don't speak because I'm provoked, I speak because I'm prepared.
She stood up, not rushed, not hesitant. Placing her hands on the table edge, eyes fixed on the judge, her voice, the source says, was measured to perfection.
Your Honor, she said, I asked to present my perspective and respond to the allegations made by the plaintiff.
And, according to the source, this is all it took for Judge Masters to interrupt, sharply.
Yeah. Miss Bondi, he said, this is a court of law, not a press room. I expect you to understand the difference between legal argument and political grandstanding.
Pam's reply was calm and firm, though.
I understand completely, Your Honor, and what I intend to present is grounded in legal precedent, not personal opinion.
But the source says, before she could even reach for her documents, Judge Masters cut her off with a gavel tap.
You should be mindful of your tone, the book recounts him saying, his voice laced with what the source calls menace. The arrogance in your demeanor has crossed the boundary of what this court will tolerate.
And then the fine.
$1,000 for conduct unbecoming.
Wow. Just like that. The source mentions a muffled chuckle from the press gallery.
Yeah, and describes the disbelief in the room that such a calm procedural statement could be cast as defiance. According to the book, Judge Masters had delivered the first psychological blow, a clear attempt to tilt the balance.
And how did Pam react to that fine, that moment of public chastisement?
The book highlights her reaction. She didn't flinch or look wounded. It says she met the judge's glare with the gaze of someone who had seen powerful figures pulled down by small things.
Her stare, according to the source, was locked on Masters, not in protest, but like a mirror reflecting the bias that the source claims was now unmistakably on display.
A reporter whispered, "He's overplaying it." A camera clicked, capturing, as the book describes, Pam's composure.
The source notes Whitman remained silent, knowing the judge had tilted the balance, but not anticipating Pam's ability to absorb the blow without retreating.
So Pam then simply placed her folder softly on the table, pulled out a single sheet, and the source says, spoke with clarity.
What did she say?
I have prepared my documentation to demonstrate that my statement falls entirely within the bounds of protected speech under New York Times versus Sullivan and that it did not target any individual.
But Judge Masters interrupted again. He wasn't having it.
No. I don't need a case law roll call as if this were a lecture, he snapped, according to the source. You're continuing to show a lack of respect for this court. He tapped the gavel again, an unspoken warning.
And Pam's reply, with a tilted head and locked gaze, as described in the book.
I'm not lecturing, Your Honor. I'm citing the law that protects a basic right every citizen holds, even those on trial in rooms that disapprove of them.
Ooh. The source says a silence, taut as piano wire, stretched across the courtroom then.
Yeah. Pam sat down with deliberate control. Judge Masters, according to the book, gripped his desk, and the source notes a flicker of hesitation. He hadn't managed to fracture her stance.
And this moment highlights a key insight the source emphasizes. The first blow might bring momentary humiliation, but how you rise from it
Forces the entire room to stop and listen. Exactly.
Pam sat back down, her words, as the source describes them, landing like a chess move. Her gaze swept the room, measuring the silence, the waiting eyes.
The media watched, a reporter whispering into a mic. She's been penalized, but she hasn't flinched. Look, her breathing's still steady. The book says curiosity was growing.
She stood again, the source notes, without any timid request, a deliberate move. Her voice, according to the book, was low yet sharp, firm yet clear.
Your Honor, she stated, I'm not here to argue about feelings. The law is not based on emotion. The law is based on principle. And the principle here is the First Amendment. She lifted her chin, eyes straight on the judge.
This is where she really brings the law to bear, specifically citing New York Times v. Sullivan from 1964. What did she argue using that case?
She used it to remind the court that public statements about public figures, which she argued her statement was, are not defamatory without clear evidence of actual malice, that standard of knowing falsehood or reckless disregard for the truth.
And the source notes a subtle shift in the judge's gaze here.
Yeah, the book says he was reassessing her, seeing not just someone emotional or political, but a well-armed conservative mind embodying something the source implies he disliked.
She continued at a slower pace, pressing each word. The source describes her argument. Freedom of speech has limits, absolutely, but subjective hurt feelings, no matter how real, can't silence uncomfortable political opinion.
If feeling offended is enough, she argued, according to the book, then we're no longer talking about free speech, we're talking about emotional censorship.
And she didn't stop there. She then cited Hustler magazine v. Falwell from 1988.
Another key precedent. The source uses this to show her argument that even shocking or controversial speech is protected under the First Amendment, especially concerning public figures. Without clear evidence, the speaker knowingly lied with malicious intent.
So her argument was there was no evidence she knew which specific program was extreme, or that she intentionally tried to destroy anyone's reputation.
Precisely. The source notes Judge Masters folded his arms at this point, something stirring in his gaze. He couldn't just dismiss her legal arguments out of hand.
Her voice dropped then, growing sharper, as the source describes, in its precision.
Yeah, she emphasized the context in official press conference, discussing the allocation of public funds. Commenting that content she found divisive shouldn't be federally financed, she argued, was an opinion, not an accusation aimed at an individual.
And if this is defamatory, just because someone feels targeted,
then we're giving emotion the power to dismantle the entire legal system. That was her point.
The source describes Judge Masters asking, "Are you finished?" and notes that the timing revealed he had been forced to recalibrate his view of her.
He wasn't just dealing with a political figure. He was dealing with a skilled legal mind.
And Pam's final strike in this initial part of her presentation, according to the source, was evidence. She pulled out a small silver USB drive.
Ah, the video she wanted to show earlier.
Exactly. She requested to present the original, unedited press conference, video and audio. She stated, according to the book, that it would make it clear her statements weren't directed at individuals, but were a general critique of public fund allocation.
This was her attempt to ground the discussion in factual context rather than just interpretation.
But Judge Masters refused, striking the gavel once.
The court will not admit the video at this time, the source quotes him saying. Its presentation would unduly influence the audience and steer the trial away from its legal scope. He folded his hands with what the source calls cool confidence.
And Pam's reaction?
Described as tilting her head with quiet bitterness. She saw the deck stacked against her in that moment, but the source says she was still playing by the rules.
Your Honor, she said, this video isn't meant to stir emotion. It's data. And if the law has no place for data, then what exactly are we ruling on?
It's a good question. The source notes Whitman smiled, nodding, recognizing the judge had, from his perspective, successfully blocked this piece of evidence.
Pam sat down, offering no further argument or protest. The source says only one thing showed in her eyes. I will wait.
Her belief, as framed by the book, facts endure longer than feeling, even when pushed aside.
Judge Masters scribbled, moving on, but the source states the longer-than-usual silence proved he understood the video would, in fact, undermine the emotional narrative the plaintiff had presented.
The plaintiff remained silent. Pam slid the USB back into her folder, closing it with a motion the source describes as almost ceremonial. She hadn't let go, she had only put it away, waiting for the right moment.
And that moment of waiting, of tension, continued during the recess.
It did. The source describes the tension as palpable. Pam sat alone in the attorney room, her hand resting on her briefcase, tracing a small object hidden inside.
A secret weapon, the book calls it, that she had prepared, never truly expecting to use it.
Yeah, quite dramatic. We'll get to what it was. When the bell signaled the end of the break, the source says Pam took a deep breath, her eyes opening with a sharp gleam of a Damascus blade.
The book describes her walking down the hall with a rhythm of resolve, a clear refusal to yield.
Back in the courtroom, Judge Masters returned, described as dignified and confident. Pam's stance was upright, showing no trace of doubt, but inside, the source notes, something stirred like molten lava.
The book says she had spotted the first crack in what it calls the unshakable wall of justice leaning toward the opposing side. This, she knew, was the time to strike.
Judge Masters entered with a calm gaze. The trial, he likely felt, was back on track. He didn't know Pam had a card, according to the source, that wasn't in his rule book.
A card protected by the very foundations of justice he cited.
Exactly. Please be seated, Masters announced. Whitman was ready to proceed, file in hand. But Pam, the source says, stood up suddenly, decisively, disregarding the normal protocol, effectively upstaging Whitman.
Her voice, the book says, rang out evenly, with a strange power. 3 words that brought the room to silence.
I have a supplement.
Just 3 words.
Just 3 words. The source describes Whitman freezing in confusion, the room silenced. Pam continued before the judge could speak, leaving no room for objection. And then came the crucial 5 words that pierced the air and plunged the room into silence. Not about the statement about the proceedings.
Whoa! Journalists, the source notes, leaned over their notepads. So the supplement wasn't about her original controversial statement at all.
No. The source says Pam then placed the small matte black device on the table, a voice recorder.
Ah, that was the hidden object.
That was it. Every eye, according to the book, was on it as if it were a ticking bomb.
And what was on that recorder?
Pam pressed play, and Judge Masters' voice was clearly broadcast.
You came in here with what a suit and a few law books I've ruled on cases like this before you even finished high school.
Oh my goodness.
The source notes it was laced with unmistakable contempt and bias.
Wow. The source describes the recording ending, but its echo lingering in the room. What was the reaction? Chaos.
More like stunned silence first. The courtroom froze, stunned faces everywhere, paralyzed by hearing bias, as described by the source, unmasked. The book says it created a gash in the image of judicial impartiality.
And the murmur started.
Yeah, a low murmur swelled as reporters reacted. That was him, no denying it. A young reporter snapped a photo of the recorder. And the judge. How did he react to hearing his own words played back?
According to the source, Judge Masters faltered at the bench. His body was still, seconds dragging, his face turning as pale as paper. The steel the source had noted in his eyes cracked, revealing a flicker of panic.
The book says he understood. Something had gone deeply wrong.
Definitely. But Pam's focus wasn't on him in that moment, was it?
No. The source says she let him face the echo of his own words. She turned calmly to the court clerk, who was frozen with her pen halted mid-stroke.
And a request.
Simple and composed, according to the source. I request that this audio recording be entered into the court record as evidence of the presiding judge's bias. The book notes no one interrupted her now.
And Whitman, the plaintiff's attorney.
Frozen, his previous look of victory replaced by a man whose ground had just given way. The source says he understood that if the evidence were admitted, the case would fundamentally shift, and the judge would likely have to be reassigned.
Judge Masters, according to the source, regained some composure, his voice low. When and under what circumstances was this recording made, Counselor Bondi? He asked.
Pam's answer was clean, clear, and devoid of commentary or gloating.
3 days ago, in the corridor behind courtroom 302, I came to confirm a hearing schedule with your office. You received me and made those remarks, Your Honor. The source emphasizes she simply let the facts and the truth speak.
A heavy silence followed. The judge spoke again, the source noting he sounded pushed back, cornered.
The court will review the admissibility of this recording during the lunch recess. His voice had lost its firmness, becoming, the book says, guarded, tentative. He struck the gavel softly, almost reluctantly, adjourning court for 15 minutes.
Masters exited, his robe fluttering, like as the source puts it, closing a curtain on a play that had gone completely off script.
The courtroom woke up, a buzz of whispers, a feeling of freedom returning as the judge's perceived authority crumbled in that moment. Others reacted. A reporter snapping a photo of the recorder, an elderly lawyer letting out a breath.
And Pam's stance through all of this, still composed.
The source says it remained firm, upright. Her eyes, the book says, burned with pure flame. Not anger, not vengeance, but clarity. She was, according to the source, unmasking a system she felt had been manipulated, a system once thought untouchable.
The echo of that recording hadn't faded. The source says it shifted the courtroom into a completely new state. The silence was no longer submissive.
Pens, according to the book, turned toward exposing power. In that moment, Pam Bondi was no longer just the lone defendant, but someone, the source argues, unmasking the system from within.
When court resumed, Judge Masters returned, his face, the source says, harder, his stride lacking its usual total control.
He announced, avoiding eye contact, that the court wouldn't admit the recording as formal evidence at this time. Note that phrasing, "at this time."
Right. Interesting choice of words.
But acknowledged, the book says, the concern about impartiality. He nodded, but the source notes a tremor in his voice revealing his authority had indeed cracked.
And this is where Pam makes her next strategic move, using the system's own rules against the bias she'd exposed.
Exactly. The source says her move wasn't just as a defendant now, but effectively as a prosecutor of the system itself. Her voice was firm as she cited U.S. Code Title 28, Section 455.
Which is?
That's the federal statute that requires judges to disqualify themselves when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. She formally requested that the judge recuse himself, citing grounds of prejudicial statements, demonstrable bias, and conduct undermining public confidence.
Wow. The source describes the reaction to this. Frozen air. It calls it a revolutionary declaration from a woman standing alone.
Judge Masters' jaw tightened, his eyes locked on Pam for what the book calls 2 taut seconds. Then he looked down to write a ritualistic gesture, but one that the source notes made it clear he had lost moral authority.
Pam didn't stop there, though.
No. She followed up, turning to the clerk and requesting the recusal request be formally entered. She stated, according to the source, she would submit a formal complaint to the Federal Judicial Conduct Board if the case proceeded under him.
Putting maximum pressure on. And the press reaction outside.
The source says the press exploded in action phones lighting up, recorders on, lenses swinging. A reporter from the Hill was overheard whispering, "She's not just arguing, she's putting the ethics of the whole system on trial."
A Politico correspondent muttered, "Push the headline early, this is turning."
Right. The source clarifies Pam's motivation here wasn't about seeking cameras or press attention in that moment. It was, the book says, about doing it for justice, pulling back toward its proper axis, not through outrage, not through tears, but through the one thing the powerful fear most, a clear-minded individual who will not back down.
And the plaintiff's side through all this, Whitman,
remained silent, according to the source. Whitman, the book says, was calculating, knowing that if the judge changed, their emotional leverage would falter, and their accusations would have to rely purely on legal, factual ground.
Judge Masters, according to the source, exhaled, his voice softer, reluctant. The court will recess to consider the motion to recuse.
And the source notes a key detail. He stood without the gavel this time, a symbol of his diminished authority. The book says he exited like someone who understood he had just lost something far more significant than his chair, the trust it once commanded.
For 15 minutes, the court clerk announced the recusal was granted and a replacement judge appointed.
No explanation was offered, no attempt, the source says, to protect dignity. The statement was cold and mechanical.
The plaintiff's reaction?
Whitman, blinking, clearly unprepared, according to the book. Pam's reaction, however, as the source describes, was to remain seated, place her pen down, and look up a gesture that the book interprets as, "This isn't a victory, this is what should have existed from the beginning."
And the news spread fast. Headlines, the source recounts, included, "Judge Masters steps down after allegations of gender and political bias."
Photos circulated widely, comparing his face as he left to Pam sitting calmly. Legal analysts weighed in. A Yale law professor on X stating, Pam Bondi just did it with evidence and unshakable calm.
Fox News declared, Pam Bondi the lawyer who needed no lawyer. And the Washington Post ran with, when logic defeated emotion.
The source makes it undeniable. She became a symbol in that moment, not via any PR campaign, but by standing her ground when the system, as the source claims, seemed to want her to fall.
The source delves into Pam's personal reaction to this. It describes her not reading or checking her buzzing phone. Her focus remained on her file folder and notes.
The book says she didn't feel like a star, but felt heavier praise. The source notes brings responsibility. The question echoing in her mind was, if I don't uphold fairness myself, who will protect what I just stood for today?
Messages, the source says, flooded in, though. A former advisor sent a short note. You just did what most law school deans don't even dare to teach.
A law student wrote, you made me believe women don't need to shout, just understand the law. And a Reddit comment with over 40,000 upvotes, according to the source, read, Bondi didn't smash the system. She fixed it using what the system had forgotten. Justice has no political color.
The source also notes how even critics on the left weighed in. An MSNBC op-ed argued, Pam's victory is a triumph of cold logic over real pain.
A feminist activist criticized, not acknowledging emotion doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The right to hurt is also part of justice. Yet, what even critics couldn't deny, according to the source, was that Pam didn't attack, insult, or dodge responsibility. She used the law.
Stepping out of the SUV at home, a reporter asked how it felt to be recognized by both sides. Pam's reply, according to the source,
I don't need recognition from both sides. I just need the law to leave no one behind, not me.
The door closed. Social media, the source notes, exploded outside. Inside her house, with tea, she set the file aside and reread the statutes, reminding herself, the spotlight is just a reflection. What truly remains is the foundation.
Okay, so with Judge Masters recused, the trial resumes with a new judge. Who does the source introduce?
That afternoon, a new judge entered. Judge Monica Reyes. The source describes her as not tall, not speaking with flourish, but possessing composition, perceptive eyes, and balance.
Okay.
A Latina, former federal prosecutor, appointed on merit. The book says her presence alone was enough to still the whispers in the courtroom.
And how did that change the atmosphere, according to the source? Did things feel different?
Oh, yeah. The press went silent. The plaintiff's side tensed. Pam, for the first time since the trial began, exhaled, feeling that the law, not her identity, would be what got judged today.
Judge Reyes took control immediately, speaking plainly, without performance. I don't care about anyone's name or political affiliation in this courtroom. I look at evidence, and I expect everyone here to do the same.
The source notes her words sliced gently, clearing the air of the lingering noise and perceived bias.
Pam felt, according to the source, she no longer needed armor. She could simply be herself, a woman who knew the law, believed in it, and was prepared to lay everything on the line if the judge listened without bias.
The source notes Whitman was visibly unsettled, his team sitting lower. They knew their previous emotional and psychological plays, successful under the previous judge according to the source, would likely fall flat under Ray's scrutiny.
So Pam's presentation shifted. It wasn't just defense now, it was presenting truth. She submitted the full, verified press conference transcript.
And the judge?
Judge Reyes nodded, allowing the documents. No interruption, no scolding tone, no dismissing evidence emotionally. It felt, the source says, like stepping into a courtroom defined by the Constitution.
And how did this new judicial attitude impact the plaintiff's case? Did Whitman struggle?
When it was Whitman's turn, the source says he was more hesitant. He still alleged damages, but the certainty was gone. The book says his numbers didn't land.
And Judge Reyes interrupted him at one point.
Yeah, when he cited an unverified tweet, she said, "Counsel, please stick to verifiable sources or sworn testimony. I do not recognize social media posts as admissible evidence."
The source highlights this as a clear line drawn between public opinion and the rule of law, something the previous judge, according to the source, seemed less inclined to do.
Pam's internal reaction to this pivotal moment.
According to the source, she looked at her folder, knowing the battle ahead was still long, but the ground was level. Standing on flat ground, the book says, felt like victory after walking on the tilted surface of perceived bias.
So, in the late afternoon light, with the atmosphere now still and focused, Pam stood with her folder again. The source describes it not just as paperwork, but a lantern, a tool for illuminating truth as she prepared to deliver what the book calls a blade of evidence.
The plaintiff has argued that my statement directly caused the View to lose advertisers, suffer ratings drops, and face reputational damage, she stated. She told the court she believed it would find this inaccurate.
And then she presented the evidence the source says was so powerful. What was it?
She held up the first chart, Nielsen data showing the View's audience decline. The source notes it began in April, while her statement was in early July.
Before her statement.
Exactly. There was a quiet stir among observers. She cited Nielsen's June 3rd report, attributing a sustained decline to unbalanced content and lack of politically diverse guest appearances. She asserted, this cannot be ignored.
And she had more evidence on the financial claims, the lost advertisers?
Yes. Addressing the claim advertisers pulled out specifically due to her remarks, she cited financial disclosures from Greenmark, an independent ad agency.
Okay.
The source emphasizes that 5 of 8 withdrawn contracts were terminated prior to her statement, based on internal brand surveys citing decreased relevance among neutral audiences. She slid copies to the clerk.
And the judge's reaction.
The source notes there were no objections, no interruptions from Judge Reyes. Each fact, the book says, landed like a hidden blade. Judge Reyes reviewed quickly, nodding. The court acknowledges the submission, she stated. The plaintiff will respond during their next round of argument.
The source highlights that the judge's tone was even, but its neutrality amplified the weight of Pam's data.
Whitman, according to the source, conferred with his assistants, concern now evident in his eyes. The emotionless facts had, as the book puts it, severed their emotional narrative.
Pam returned to her seat with quiet poise. The source notes she wasn't done, but she was letting others sit with what had just been exposed. She wasn't rushing the tempo. Her blade, the book says, was placed at a fissure in the case.
Whoopi Goldberg, the source describes, sat stiffly, hands clenched, her face holding a different kind of silence, that of someone realizing emotion no longer leads and truth begins to speak.
Pam didn't feel like she was striking back, according to the source, but restoring a stage, illuminating truth, sweeping away shadow.
Judge Reyes acknowledged Pam, stating the court appreciates the clarity and credibility of your evidence. She then turned to the plaintiff, giving them 15 minutes to review and respond.
But adding, significantly, if you do not produce clearly opposing data, the court will treat the defense's evidence as credible.
That's huge. Pam knew the trial wouldn't end here, but according to the source, momentum had clearly turned. The court was now forced to see her differently.
Not the accused instigator, but the person who, the source argues, understood the law best and had the evidence to prove it.
Pam knew, according to the source, the plaintiff's side was unraveling. She saw it in Whitman's actions, his glances, in Whoopi's silence.
But she wasn't going to stop at uncertainty. She wanted absolute clarity. The source says this required one more step.
She rose again, this time without a folder, just 2 sheets of paper. Her expression, the book says, stripped of hesitation. Her voice was sharpened like a blade.
And she addressed the point the plaintiff had tried to make about social media reactions proving actual malice.
Right, that online anger equaled legal malice. What was her evidence against that?
Presenting printed copies of the tweets cited by the plaintiff, she stated they were not written by her, and, according to the source, there was no indication she incited, encouraged, or directed any of these attacks.
And her argument, how did she frame it?
Her voice grew firmer, instructing the room. The source describes her argument. Tweets are simply public reactions, emotions amplified by social media. If a negative online reaction alone can prove malice, she argued, then anyone expressing a political opinion becomes a scapegoat for collective offense, even when they named no one.
That point resonates. The source notes she paused to let it land. Her words, a powerful reminder that the law, at its core, is not based on crowd feelings.
Continuing, she cited NYTV Sullivan, again reinforcing that actual malice requires knowing falsehood or reckless disregard. She directly asked, "Where is the proof that I knowingly said something false?"
And she answered her own question.
Yeah. She said, "Social media reaction proves only one thing: emotion is flammable. The internet is the match, but I didn't strike it." She emphasized she was speaking within her role, making a public political comment, naming no one.
And if this statement, naming no one, is defamatory just because someone feels targeted based on public reaction,
then we are giving emotion the power to dismantle the entire legal system. That was her core argument. Her voice dropped then, becoming, the source says, more dangerous in its restraint.
if a tweet can prove malice, she argued, public speakers must ask, could a neutral statement cost me my livelihood because someone misunderstood it online?
And her conclusion, That isn't law, that's fear, and I refuse to live in a country where free speech is strangled by fear.
Powerful stuff. The source says purporters transcribed every word, keystrokes pounding. Someone in the gallery, according to the book, shook their head in awe.
Pam remains still, her posture straight, her tone and gaze, the source notes, unmarred by performance.
Whitman started to respond, but Judge Reyes stopped him. Her voice was neutral but carried weight.
Miss Bondi, she stated, accurately cited a standard established by Supreme Court President. Unless direct evidence of knowing falsehood or reckless disregard was provided, the court, she ruled, would not permit further use of social media commentary as legal argument.
Basically shutting down that line of argument.
Completely. Cameras clicked. A law student whispered, "She just taught the entire room without a podium."
Pam, the source says, felt certainty, not pride. She wasn't just defending herself. She was reminding the courtroom and society that the law doesn't arbitrate who feels more offended. It determines truth and draws lines based on evidence and principle.
The source describes a realization dawning on some. This trial wasn't simply about punishing a controversial comment. It had, in that moment, become a masterclass in legal reasoning, intellectual courage.
The atmosphere shifted, a hushed, sharp and quiet, where those who understood the law knew it was the moment to strike.
Pam sat still, her finger resting on a marked page. The source calls it her final arrow. Judge Reyes, the book says, read the faces in the room, seeing the plaintiff had nothing left, their case leaning heavily on emotion and social media.
Which Pam had systematically dismantled using legal principle and verifiable facts.
Exactly. Judge Reyes turned to Pam, her voice even and serious. She asked if Mrs. Bondi had any additional relevant legal points.
Pam didn't rush. She calmly flipped to the page, stood, holding her folder, which the source now describes not as paperwork, but as a lantern casting the final light of truth.
Her declaration was, according to the source, the final precedent she needed to cite to clarify the constitutional foundation for protected speech. She returned to Hustler magazine v. Falwell from 1988.
Right, the case about offensive speech being protected.
She stated that even offensive, satirical, or controversial speech is protected unless there is clear evidence the speaker knowingly published false information with actual malice. The book notes she emphasized that even morally repugnant content was protected if there was no proof of intentional falsehood.
And she applied this precedent directly to her case.
Yes. She stated, as described in the source, that her press conference statement had no names, insults, or personal attacks. It commented on public funding for divisive programs. Allowing such a statement, she argued, as grounds for legal action would set a standard far beyond what the Supreme Court has ever upheld.
The courtroom went still, the source says. Even those who had been dismissive saw her wielding the law with undeniable skill. The air tightened.
The source notes the afternoon sun caught the glass behind her. Framing her face, the book says, not as a defendant, but as a prosecutor delivering judgment on the very system that had once turned on her.
Her final words were, according to the source, powerful and direct.
I'm not asking for forgiveness, she stated, because I didn't commit a wrong. I'm not asking to be understood because what I said was clear, and I'm asking to be judged on the basis every American is promised the Constitution, where speaking the truth without hate, without deception, is not a crime.
Wow. The source describes Judge Reyes' reaction. A tilted head, eyes deep with thought, a glint of recognition not of emotion, but of principle.
The book says she was hearing the voice the law was created to protect, a reasoned, unshakable claim of fundamental rights.
The plaintiff's bench was silent. Whitman didn't rise. Whoopi was motionless, fingers clenched. The source says she was, in that moment, recognizing the case wasn't about her personal feelings anymore,
but about truth versus influence, public image versus constitutional boundaries.
Judge Reyes gave a solemn nod, acknowledging the supplemental argument and stating federal precedent would be fully considered during deliberation. Her voice was even, the source notes, but it was a final signal. The era of emotional leverage had ended. The law would speak.
Pam sat down, not with tension, but, the source says, with a light chest. A weight lifted. She looked up at the bench, waiting.
The courtroom silence felt, as the source describes, sacred. Everyone was witnessing something beyond expectation. Judge Reyes bowed her head, her face revealing nothing, about to speak.
And then she spoke, not loudly, not sternly. She stated she had reviewed the evidence, arguments, and precedents, specifically citing NYTV Sullivan and Hustler v. Falwell.
Okay, and the finding.
The court found, she stated, that the defendant, Pamela Bondi, made a policy statement in her official capacity that didn't target the plaintiff directly, contained no knowingly false information, and didn't meet the actual malice standard required by law. There was no direct evidence, she concluded, of intent to cause personal harm.
So the ruling.
Accordingly, under the applicable law, the court rules the defendant bears no legal liability. The case is dismissed. All claims for damages are denied. No gavel bang, just a final, decisive nod.
Dismissed. The room, the source says, exhaled. A quiet wave of relief, not celebration. Pam lowered her eyes, lips pressed, exhaling softly, like someone emerging from a forest without a path.
Applause began, light and scattered, building. The source notes it wasn't a stage crowd, but those witnessing someone who refused to fall, standing her ground between perceived prejudice and legal principle.
The press stood, lenses turning, questions firing.
Pam rose, facing Reyes first with a nod of gratitude, then the reporters. Her voice was low, grounded, unwavering, as described by the source. I don't feel like I won. I feel like I was allowed to live again in a system I once believed in and still want to believe in. This wasn't my victory. It was the law's when it's given the space to speak without being drowned out by emotion.
And Whoopi Goldberg. Her reaction.
Remained seated initially, her reaction unreadable. The book describes not rage, but the quiet of someone learning that not every truth validates feelings. She then stood, walked out, not looking back at Pam, but the source notes, not lowering her head either.
Whitman gathered his documents, following his client, exiting, the source says, a game he thought he'd mastered, realizing the rules, under a different judge, weren't in his favor.
One cycle closed, and a new gate quietly opened. A stranger lawyer, the source notes, nodded to Pam, a quiet acknowledgement of someone, he felt, bringing truth back to the courtroom.
A new judge would arrive later, but the source argues the trial had changed, forever returned to a place where truth could find its voice.
Pam leaned back, closing her eyes, imprinting the moment. Not for its sweetness, the source says, but to remember that one person alone made the system stop and look.
And just when you think the story ends there, the source brings us to an unexpected encounter right outside the courtroom. This is quite something.
It really is. Stepping out of the courtroom, Pam entered a hallway that, the source says, felt like a different world. Silence stretched across the granite floor, reflecting her steady heels. Reporters followed respectfully.
As if the verdict hadn't just ended a battle, but raised an invisible perimeter of solemn air.
Exactly. Pam said nothing more in that moment, her words from inside echoing. The click of her heels, the source notes, was a reminder. This is the ground of justice, and she hadn't backed down.
Then a voice cut through the silence. Bondi.
Pam stopped, not needing to turn. Whoopi Goldberg stood a few steps away, her voice deep, gruff, the outrage from the stand, the source says, now gone.
Pam turned, not defensively, not politely, but as the source describes, just steady. She met Whoopi's unflinching eyes.
Two women, once adversaries on television, social media, and in court, now stood without pretense, according to the book.
Whoopi walked forward slowly, not with pride, not broken. She stopped before Pam.
I don't like you, her voice unwavering, and I probably never will. She paused, breathing softly. But I respect you.
Wow. The source notes Pam remained silent. The bluntness didn't surprise her, but the silence that followed, the book says, mattered.
The person offering respect, according to the source, was forced to confront strength born from principle.
Whoopi continued, saying she used to think Pam was just a political puppet, a mouthpiece pushed forward by the system.
But today you stepped out on your own.
Pam didn't interrupt, letting her finish. And then came Tam's reply, as recorded in the source.
I didn't come here to be liked. I came to protect the right to speak the truth. You don't have to respect me. But if one day someone tries to silence your right to say what you believe, I'll stand beside you whether we agree or not.
That's quite a statement. The source describes a long beat passing. Whoopi pressed her lips together, swallowing something bitter.
Facing someone who neither bowed nor needed to tear others down to stand tall.
Whoopi then stated, "You're right, and that pisses me off."
Cam, according to the book, let out a quiet laugh, marking the end of that heavy chapter.
Pam then asked, "You think it's easy for me to stand in the middle of an emotional storm like that?"
The source says Whoopi tilted slightly, her eyes softening. The book interprets this as a moment of realization. Some enemies don't just exist to be defeated. They can help you see yourself clearly.
"You win," she said, stepping back. "But don't think this win will keep someone like me quiet. I'll still speak, I'll still challenge. The only difference is next time I won't underestimate the person stepping up to debate me."
Pam nodded, her eyes fixed. That's what justice needs, she replied, according to the source. Differing voices as long as they come from truth, not rage.
They stood still, etching the moment into memory. The source describes it as understanding, not necessarily reconciliation or embrace.
The book says it was perhaps the most meaningful moment of the trial. Whoopi turned, walking toward the light at the end of the hallway. Pam watched, not, the source says, as a victor watching an opponent retreat, but as a former adversary watching a worthy rival return.
A young reporter stopped, seeing Pam's expression. The source notes no question could capture it. The story, the book concludes, didn't need headlines. It carried its weight in silence.
A quiet ending echoing louder than any applause.
So, the trial is over. The verdict is rendered. But what happens next, according to the source? It doesn't just end there, does it?
No, not at all. The source describes Pam stepping out of the courthouse onto the steps, the city seeming to change hue. Every gaze, every reflection, every word from the day, the book says, felt like it was converging on her.
And while Pam wanted only to go home, social media, which she hadn't touched during the trial, had erupted.
Completely. The hashtag Pam Legal Genius trended, surpassing 2 million mentions in just 3 hours, according to the source. Clips of her defense, edited with epic music and bold subtitles, went viral.
Posts, the source recounts, declared, "She didn't win because she's Pam Bondi. She won because she understood the law better than the one accusing her."
Another read, "Who needs political dramas when real life has Bondi standing in court teaching the system how to apply the Constitution?"
Mainstream media picked it up too. CNN, the source says, ran the headline, "The silent defendant, loud intelligence Bondi upends courtroom stereotypes."
Fox News, "Pam Bondi, the lawyer who needed no lawyer." The Washington Post, "The Whoopi Bondi case when logic defeated emotion."
The source makes it undeniable. She became a symbol in that moment not due to any PR campaign, but by standing her ground when the system, as the source claims, seemed to want her to fall.
But the source details Pam's personal state in the middle of that storm. She sat alone in her black SUV, heading home. She didn't check her phone or turn on the TV.
On her lap was her file folder, containing evidence, reelings, notes scribbled at 3 a.m. Looking out the window, the book says she didn't feel like a star. She felt heavier.
Praise, the source notes, brings responsibility. The question echoing in her mind was, if I don't uphold fairness myself, who will protect what I just stood for today?
Messages, the source says, flooded in, though. A former advisor sent a short note. "You just did what most law school deans don't even dare to teach."
A law student wrote, "You made me believe women don't need to shout, just understand the law." And a Reddit comment with over 40,000 upvotes, according to the source, read, "Bondi didn't smash the system. She fixed it using what the system had forgotten. Justice has no political color."
The source also notes how even critics on the left weighed in. An MSNBC op-ed argued, "Pam's victory is a triumph of cold logic over real pain."
A feminist activist criticized, "Not acknowledging emotion doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The right to hurt is also part of justice." Yet, what even critics couldn't deny, according to the source, was that Pam didn't attack, insult, or dodge responsibility in her defense.
When the car stopped at her gate, a reporter asked how it felt to be recognized by both sides. Pam's reply, according to the source,
"I don't need recognition from both sides. I just need the law to leave no one behind, not me."
The door closed. Social media, the source notes, exploded outside. Inside her house, with P, she set the file aside and reread the statutes, reminding herself the spotlight is just a reflection. What truly remains is the foundation.
That night, the source says Pam sat at her desk. The trial folder was set aside, a blank page before her. The lawsuit wasn't just an ending. It was a test.
And its result gave her a chance to be heard by supporters and critics alike. The book describes her realizing that a system could drift from its principles due to the emotion of those in power.
She needed to speak, the source says, from within.
And the very next day, according to the source, she visited a retired federal judge friend, not with case files, but with an 18-page reform proposal.
Wow, okay. What was the topic?
Transparency in federal judicial appointments and mandatory bias recognition training for judges. Her friend's reaction, according to the book, "Pam, this isn't the petition, you're redrawing the map."
So she's taking her experience and trying to change the system.
Exactly. The source says the proposal began circulating among legal professionals, research institutes, judicial councils, and ethics committees. Every clause, the book notes, was drawn directly from her trial experience, the subtle biases, the condescension, dismissing evidence due to perceived prejudice.
And the lack of clearer tools to challenge it.
Right. In a closed-door session at the U.S. Institute of Justice, Pam presented her case to 30 experts. The source emphasizes, no cameras, no hashtags, just the law.
And when she closed with the line, "We cannot keep handing the power of judgment to those who have never been taught to examine themselves," the room fell silent. A Harvard professor is quoted in the source saying, "You just touched on what everyone knows, but no one dares write as a headline."
And then came something unexpected, according to the source. An invitation from the Senate Judiciary Committee to testify on judicial ethics.
Okay, that's big. This, the book says, stirred the media again, with hashtags asking, "Is Bondi reforming the system?"
A seasoned commentator remarked, as quoted in the source, "For the first time, we're seeing someone walk out of a courtroom inferno and return to rebuild the system using the very bricks once thrown at her."
Public opinion, the source notes, was split skeptics versus those who had been victims of bias, seeing in her something rare clarity after victory.
They didn't need her to be eloquent. They needed her not to stay silent after what she had witnessed and experienced.
Pam's approach, as described by the source, wasn't to respond to every comment or critique. She showed up at the right time and forum, with the right document and a single commitment.
Which was?
"I'm not rebuilding the system for me. I'm building it for the next person who may have no recorder, no network, no luck."
A reporter in a Capitol hallway asked if she thought of herself as a reform icon. Pam's reply, according to the source.
"I don't need to be an icon. I need to get the work done."
And the source takes us to one more fascinating moment stemming from this case. This is really something.
It is. The setting is the Federal Institute of Justice in Washington, D.C., described as a monument to justice. A routine judicial training session is underway in the Grand Hall.
And the unexpected opening speaker, according to the source, is former Judge Jerome Masters.
The judge who recused himself, wow. The source describes him as changed, gone, it says, is the commanding presence, the aura of authority, the black robe, the disdainful glare.
He wore a simple gray suit. His hand trembled slightly on the microphone, cradling humility. His eyes swept the room with a searching look, hoping, the book says, to be understood.
His voice was steady, clear, weighty. The voice, the source concludes, of a man who had traversed the depths of his pride.
Masters began speaking, according to the source. "I used to think I understood the law. I used to sit above it all, gazing down, until I met a woman who would not accept that."
Silence, the book says, fell in the hall, history being rewritten in real time. Sunlight, the source notes, illuminated the lines on his face, hinting at an inner transformation.
And his confession, as relayed in the source, is quite remarkable. He didn't hold back.
"Not at all," Masters confessed. "I ruled wrongly. I let personal bias, deeply rooted and unexamined even within myself, tip the scales I was meant to hold in balance, and had there not been someone strong enough to stand still before my anger, courageous enough to speak the truth, I might still believe I was blameless."
The source describes this confession as raw and unguarded, and notes the audience reacted not with judgment, but awe at this unqualified, honest apology.
And then a woman's voice rose from the back.
And he didn't run from that mistake. Every eye turned, according to the source. Pam Bondi, described with golden hair, navy suit, steady blue eyes, walked the center aisle with quiet, unhurried steps.
The source notes there was no urgency, no triumph, no smugness, just profound composure. She stood beside Masters, the book says, as though no wound had ever been between them.
And what did she say in that moment, standing next to the man who had fined her and, according to the source, shown her such contempt? It must have been surreal.
Pam's statement, as recorded in the source. "Truth doesn't gain its worth just when we win. It holds greater value, deeper meaning, and longer endurance when the very person who once resisted it comes by to defend it. That's when we know truth is no longer anyone's weapon. It becomes the torch lighting the path for all of us."
Wow. The source describes a young attendee whispering, "Are they really standing together on the same stage?" Disbelief mixed with open admiration. They remembered Masters' past look at Pam, described earlier in the book.
The session began. A joint lecture, unprecedented, on recognizing personal bias in judging. Master spoke of the immense cost of pride in the justice system, decisions made from excessive confidence, painful awakenings.
Realizing even on the high bench, he was still just a man prone to bias. He shared his lived experience, according to the source.
And Pam spoke from her perspective.
She did. The source says she spoke of silence as a strategy, of enduring, waiting for logic to prevail. Stories of despair, long nights, near surrender, finding strength to stand up not just for herself, but for what she saw as true justice and equality.
The source notes they complemented each other, two distinct notes harmonizing. The things that had pushed them apart now, the book says, filled each other's gaps, forming a more complete portrait of justice. Neither could paint alone.
The audience, according to the source, shifted from shock to admiration, skepticism to reflection, Gratitude.
During the break, a young female judge approached Pam, confessing, as quoted in the source, "I used to think judges couldn't be wrong. Today I learned that admitting a mistake isn't weakness, it's the first step to judging fairly."
And Pam's gentle response.
She smiled gently, looking at Masters. "You learned that," she said, according to the source, "because someone had the courage to make things right, and more importantly, because you saw that act welcomed, not punished or ridiculed. That is a mark of a system beginning to heal itself."
At the end of the day, the source describes the sunset glowing. No one left with a casual stride. Many were still in conversation, eyes lit with inspiration and introspection.
They were reminded, the book says, the gavel is a symbol of responsibility requiring humility and clarity, and that those who misused power can, in fact, become catalysts for reform.
A legal journalist's commentary that followed, titled, according to the source, "When Rivals Become Allies, A Lesson in Humility," noted they weren't surprised by Pam's courage, but by Masters standing beside her.
This, the source argues, gave the reform effort significant gravity, seeing a figure of the old order recognizing justice needed rebuilding by people like Pam Bondi.
The source ends this part of the story with Pam reading that article late at night. Folding the newspaper, her hands were steady, her eyes, the book says, not shining with triumph.
Deep in her heart, she understood. When an opponent stands beside you out of belief, you can't retreat. You must move toward real change. Turning off the light, moonlight slipped in, a reminder, the source concludes. Even in darkness, light finds a way to those who never give up.
And finally, the source brings the story to a close with Pam in a new role. Not in a courtroom, not in D.C. proposing reform.
No. The scene shifts to a modest stage at Georgetown Law Auditorium. Pam Bondi stands among the students not as a politician or media figure, but as a teacher. Her topic? Faith in the law, a faith, the source says, she fought to earn.
And she uses a powerful visual, according to the source. That's fun.
She does. She showed them the $1,000 fine she received in court, a faded, folded piece of paper. Once a mark of disrespect, the source says, now a symbol.
Pam spoke about that day without bitterness, according to the source. The day she received it, she realized she'd stepped into a fight where justice, as she saw it, wasn't at the center.
She wasn't ashamed. She kept it not to remember pain, but to remind myself that sometimes silence equals betrayal, even if you get punished for speaking up.
The source describes a student sitting straighter, his eyes holding understanding. Justice, the book says, wasn't just in case books. It lived in courage.
Pam laid the fine on the table, setting down a marker, telling her story not just to show her own strength, but because the system, if never questioned, can do wrong right within the bounds of what's technically legal. She brought, the source says, memory, living proof.
She shared her own realization, according to the source. She used to think the law was a shield, then learned it could also be a tool, but only if held without honesty and applied with integrity.
Those entering courtrooms, she argued, must hold that balance.
There was no slideshow, no images, just the voice of one who, the source says, had walked through darkness and returned to light a lamp for others.
She made no promises the system was perfectly fixed, but she gave them something essential. Proof that even if fined, torn down, or misunderstood, a person who knows the law can still change it if they're steadfast enough.
She shared why she chose to be a lawyer, according to the source. Not just to win, but because law is the only place where ordinary people can make power, not through shouting, but through truth.
Applause broke out, not on cue, but honest, building, according to the book. A shy male student approached for an autograph, holding a blank paper.
The source says he planned to print the fine and pin it to his study wall, not idolizing, but to remind himself to stay firm when told not to talk back to higher-ups.
Pam smiled, signing. She didn't promise an easier road, but she knew, the source says, a flame lit to warm would outlast any spotlight.
A senior professor caught up with her in the hallway, quoted in the source saying, "You didn't just reclaim your own dignity, Bondi. You've reignited belief in those who thought the law was only for the powerful."
Pam nodded, eyes on the light at the end of the hall. "I never believed justice was easy," she said quietly, according to the source. "But I've always believed that if we walk without compromise, the path will make room."
The trial had ended, but what was left, the source concludes, wasn't just the acquittal or the applause. It was the reminder that justice doesn't belong to those who perform emotion best, but to those steadfast under pressure.
It wasn't one with power, but with reason. Not by being loud, but by being right.
So, wrapping this up, what does all this mean? Our deep dive into this specific case, guided entirely by this source material, Pam Bondi, A Courtroom Reckoning. It really reveals the power of legal principle and intellect when, according to the book, they are pitted against emotional narratives and even alleged systemic bias within the courtroom.
Yeah, it really highlights, as the source does, the critical importance of understanding core legal concepts, like actual malice and judicial impartiality, and the sheer courage the book describes it takes to stand on that understanding even when everything feels tilted against you.
And we saw how challenging the system from within, using its own rules like citing bias and requesting recusal based on legal code can, according to the source, lead to unexpected shifts and even broader calls for reform.
And maybe most surprisingly, the source material shows how standing firmly for truth and principle, even in really sharp disagreement, can eventually lead to those unexpected moments of respect.
Like with Whoopi.
Yeah, and even alliance with former adversaries, as seen with Judge Masters and Whoopi Goldberg in the book.
This story, as told in this source, isn't just about a single lawsuit. It's about the resilience of legal principles, the potential for personal courage to impact systemic issues, and the idea that justice isn't always loud or dramatic,
Right, but it can be incredibly precise and powerful when applied correctly.
which I think raises an important question for you, our listener, to consider. Based on this deep dive into the source material, if you one day find yourself treated unfairly by a system you trusted, facing pressure or bias,
What do you do? Will you stay silent, or will you find the conviction and the tools to stand up? What side of the scale will you be on?